Ora si registrerà la conferenza.
And I hope you can all hear me. Is it okay? Just your thumbs up, okay? So today we will be talking about audience measuring technologies, and the last 8 months I had the pleasure to coordinating a group of professionals that, starting from Italy, decided to study and to go deeper into this new topic, which is kind of disruptive and which may change the way we see the analytics topic. So we will present what is the result of our study, which is actually a white paper, a long white paper, 69, 70 pages, and a nice web tool where you could explore all the different topics and the results of our studies. Before that, a little bit of agenda. So I will be giving a little bit of an introduction. In the white paper, we had the chance to study 5 different types of audience measuring technologies. So within this webinar, and since the short amount of time presenting only 2 technologies, we hope that if you are interested and want to go deeper, you just have a read of our white paper, and we will share with you the link later on. And so I will be addressing the topic of urban analytics, while Francesco will be addressing the SDK, beacon, and bitstream topic. After that, Marco will go deeper into a more legal topic by addressing the legitimacy of the processing of data collected through those technologies that we analyzed. And then Luca will give you a little bit of an overview on the DPIA topic and the web tool that we had the chance to develop all together. So I was telling you about this white paper. We had the chance to have a lot of contributors, and the main topic was to address and understand the different types of audience measuring technologies, and then understand if data protection authorities around Europe had the chance to pronounce themselves on decisions and on this topic, which is quite relevant, but has not that many insights on the privacy issue. So what we did was to talk and have a dialogue with tech profiles, and then understand how the different technologies work and worked. And then we started our research, and we started to see if data protection authorities had already decisions, and we tried to extract some of the insights that they had, and we tried to have some suggestions and complete what we thought are some of the best practices that you could find in this area. So the webinar, the white paper, you can find that on a paper version, but as I said, also on a web tool. So Luca will explain you a little bit more about the web tool after. You can download the white paper at iotprivacy.it, whilst you can scan the QR code here in this slide, or there's another link, which I'm sure we will share with you afterwards. So let's start with the first technology that we had the chance to analyze, and I will start with an example from the Bible. You all know that we had a revenge of the analytics in the digital world compared to what was the marketing and the advertising in the physical world. I mean, 20 years ago, you would find advertising and marketing all around the streets. You would invest money in having marketing in that way. But then from the 2000s, we had some ways of measuring our investments on the internet, and especially in the marketing field. So platforms as Facebook and social media, Google as well, had the chance to measure what was the impact, how many people were viewing your contents, what was their gender, and other kind of parameters, which kind of sparked the attention on the digital analytics, and with some repercussions for the physical world, right? So if you're doing advertising today, if you're doing marketing, you do that digitally, you do that online. that's because you have a way to measure things. But this is changing today. So starting from a scenario like this, where you would have nice dashboards with analytics and everything that you need to know about your users on the internet, today we have some technologies that allow us to count people and to understand some informations about them. So I said informations, I might say data, and that always sparks another kind of attention on the data protection and on the regulations that we have today on a European level. So what about privacy? What about those technologies? Are they a kind of video surveillance? Is that something similar, or do they differ from those technologies? So let's start from the first category. Image or video stream analysis acquisition systems. We try to give a definition. So those technologies are capable of acquiring and processing a sequence of photographs and extract statistical information from those photographs. This is substantially different from video surveillance systems, and I will show you in a while how they do work today. But this is the main functioning. So in most cases, those technologies, they do acquire a snapshot or a video sequence of an area. And in that area, of course, you have persons walking or just passing by. And then that very same device, the very same technology takes that snapshot or the video sequence and tracks some statistical information. Usually, those photographs or the video sequences are held for a limited duration, and they're stored on the device. So usually, if the technology works correctly, usually you won't have photographs or video sequences going outside of that very same device. So you see the boundaries here are what is personal data and what is statistical data. So how would I protect my privacy, and how would I measure things? How would I count things? So this is actually an example from one Italian company called blimp.ai. This is actually what you would see from inside the device. So the device is capable of detecting people within that very same frame, and then through machine learning algorithms, he's able to understand if that very same person is a man, is a woman, if that falls within a category of a particular age, and maybe in some cases if that person is smiling or is sad, and you name it. I mean, the parameters can be set, but they also need to be limited, of course, depending on our privacy concerns. The interesting part and the nice thing here is that under the EU regulation, GDPR, photographs are usually cataloged as personal data. But then you extract some data from the personal data, which is the photograph here, and you bring the numbers out. And then the technology, the device would cancel and erase immediately the image. So this is another example. So imagine of different environments. You could use on retail stores, for example, or in public spaces. And of course, one of the main topics is how would you let people understand what is this device, right? So for video surveillance, we do have privacy notices. We have specific laws regulating this topic. Is it the same for physical audience measuring? Is it the same for these kind of technologies? And of course, you have to let them understand that this kind of technologies is not recognizing them, so not giving an unique identifier to those people, but they're only detecting the face. So if the technology is set up properly and correctly, this is how it should work. But of course, you have a lot of risks, and you have to let people know, and you have to let them understand how this kind of technology works. So this is what I was telling you before. You start from a personal data and you go to other non-personal data. But the nice thing here, from a tech point of view, is that how do you acquire those photographs? You have them within the very same device, and you store them for 3 to 4 seconds. But according to the GDPR, if you're processing data also for 1 second, you're processing something. So you're processing personal data, so you need to show privacy notices to your users. And then, yeah, as I said, you extract non-personal data like the kinds that I've showed you here. So I told you that in the white paper, we tried to analyze some of the relevant cases from the data protection authorities. I think that they're all very, very relevant. And if you're a company or if you're a researcher looking to produce and commercialize those kind of technologies, you might want to look at cases and integrate them within your privacy documentation, processes, procedures within your company. Just a little bit of a example, I will just take one of those 2 cases. It was a case in Italy that we had in 2016. At the Milan Central Station, we had this company installing these totems in the main railway station. So the totems were actually displaying some advertisings, but they were also measuring the type of people that were seeing the advertise. So is it, as I said before, is it a woman? How old is she or he? And are they happy, or are they having fun while they're seeing my ad? So people started to notice this thing, and the Italian Data Protection Authority wanted to know more about these kind of technologies, and they started an investigation because they understood that this technology was a facial recognition technology, while the entire purpose was about having a face detection technology. What happened there? Yeah, I already explained to you this. What happened there is that they dragged some conclusions, and you will find in our white paper these kind of conclusions summarized for each case and for each technology. Sorry for this slides, it's very full, but I will try to sum that up for you. Essentially, what the Italian DPA said is that you need to show a simplified privacy notice, let's say a 1-pager, for example, and that privacy notice, you should have a QR code or a link which redirects to an extensive privacy notice where people could understand more. And most of all, if the companies producing those technologies put in place adequate precautions, they could use systems like the people counting that I was telling you before. So essentially, from an Italian point of view, the Data Protection Authority give its blessing to those kind of technologies if there are some precautions. And the other interesting thing, but I'm sure that Marco will dig deeper on this after, it's about the legal basis of processing data. Because you would think about consent, but how would you gather consent from this device which automatically stares at an area where a lot of people passes? That's not possible, right? And what the Italian DPA said in that case, which is kind of similar and has been a main ruling for those kind of technologies, is that the balance of interests is an alternative legal basis which you could use to in those cases and in the installation of those technologies. So Marco will explain you a little bit more about this, but of course you need to assess what is the main interest. So do the legitimate interest assessment and understand what is the best interest. And of course, what they said is that depending on these technologies, since they're very, very innovative and also they're recording a public space, you would need a data protection impact. That's something that you would find and will find in our white paper. We have a chapter which is specifically focused on the DPIA. So I wanted just to have an introduction and give you some addresses on this first technology. I'm sure that Francesco will follow on and will continue. So thank you all, and Francesco, it's your turn.
Ciao, Giulio. Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. One moment, let me present my slides. Okay, I think you can see on my screen. Hi everyone, thanks for having me here with you, and thanks to Julia and to all the other professionals that has been together with us and all together got here with this white paper. It's really interesting as development of these technologies goes on. So I am Francesco Barbarelli. I work in Luxottica Group as a compliance privacy expert, and I won, let's say, the part of the white paper that is dedicated to Beacon SDK and Bitstream. And in particular, how these technologies can be used respecting user privacy, and in particular in this moment in which all the regulations all over the world are moving towards giving more controls to end users. We're talking about 3 different technologies that are not all the same. They don't work in the same way, but basically they aim to the same objective, that is to show ads on the mobile phones of users. So as many of you would be aware, we are discussing about these technologies are used mainly in the mobile app world. The reason why we are discussing about these technologies in this white paper is because there are some kind of hybrid technologies. I'm referring in particular to beacons that, of course, have an interaction with the physical world and with the online world. Considering the scope of this white paper, I'll try to not focus too much on the technology itself, also because the objective itself is to understand which are the privacy impacts of the use of this technology. We're talking about we can say overall that if we want to clearly understand what we're talking about, we can refer to the, let's say, to the world of cookies and online tracking technology. Basically, we're talking about almost the same thing, but this happens on the mobile phones. In the mobile phones, we cannot have the same kind of tracking that happens on the online browsing, a classic online browsing by desktop or laptop. And so the data that are collected, that are communicated to a lot of advertisers, are the data that can be connected through the mobile phone. So basically, we try to understand what kind of categories of personal data can be processed with these technologies, how they are processed, how they can be processed in a compliant way, and how all the network of companies that can actually access this data can process it correctly. Basically, when we talk about this kind of technology, I can bring the example of the SDK. We're talking about a technology that enables an app in which it is installed, collect a basic set of information from the user device in order to communicate this set of information to a network of advertisers. Which is the objective of this is to allow this advertiser to display ads on the mobile app itself or on the mobile phone of the user. What kind of personal information are we talking about? The basic information that are collected through these technologies are the geolocation of the users, and the advertisement ID. The advertisement ID works actually as a cookie. It uniquely identifies one mobile phone and all the browsing experience into that mobile phone until a user doesn't restore the value of it. Like you can raise it as much as you want, but of course no one does. So what happens basically? We're talking about these technologies that collect this data, how they do it. When we talk about SDK, we're talking about this technology that is installed in an app that usually is created in order to give different services to users. So a classic example is the weather forecast app. You need to give access to your geolocation in order to have that sun on your lock screen. But every time that mobile app collect your GPS, basically it use the GPS not just to provide you with the latest information about the forecast, but also to send this information to this network of advertisers. So the network advertiser is a big network of subjects that need to have this information in order to show you the most relevant ads for you. How they do that? They analyze your position, your geolocation, they analyze your advertisement ID, and they try to understand which is relevant for you, and they will pay more if the service that they want to promote to you is more relevant. So this is basically the basis of all the marketing activity that happens on the mobile app world. As it can be imagined, it's not easy to understand if this data falls under the categories of personal data. For a long time, they have been considered aggregated data in, let's say, in a wrong way. They are not anonymized, they are not pseudonymized, they just have no direct identifiers in it. But they have all the story of a user. And when you have all the story of the user, basically you can come back to the user and single them out. So that's the reason why these technologies are considered now as technologies that process personal data. In particular, before GDPR implementation, the French authority has been the first authority to assess how these technologies work and how they can work in a compliant way. In our white paper, we referred to three main decisions of the CNIL that are against three companies that are called Vidmo, Timo, FeedsUp, and Battery. And basically, the CNIL got to raise a lot of points, but basically it suggested generally to all the providers of the technologies, all the developers of mobile apps, all the developers of SDK technologies, how they can use it in a compliant way. They suggested, of course, to put in place the thing that the authority asked to this company is not that easy. Basically, what they said and what they noticed is that every time that a user downloaded an app that had that SDK installed in it, they never they were never been aware of the data that were collected through this SDK and how they were used. So the first thing that they pointed out is the lack of a proper privacy notice informing the user about the processing of that. Because yes, there's a privacy notice in the weather forecast app, but they say to you that they're gonna use your geolocation data in order to provide you with the weather forecast service. They didn't say to you that in order to function, they need money, and in order to use it, to have that money, they need to give access to their platform to the network advertiser that will pay for the spaces that will show you the relevant ads for you. So the first thing first, the CNIL said you need to inform your customers, you need to inform users. The burden of the information, the privacy notice in this case, can be both on the SDK developer, in case the SDK developer is also the developer of the app itself, but it can be only on the app developer that use SDK services of another company. It's really important that they inform users. They have to inform users about how this technology works, how these data are processed, and about the list of the companies that access to this data through the AD network. And this is the tricky part, let's say, because we're talking about dynamic list of companies. They are not always the same. They work with an aggregator of companies. So it's kind of difficult to list all the companies that can actually access this data. They have, and there's another purpose in order to collect this data that the user should be informed about. In the very moment that you're selling the advertisement to this company of the network, you have also to inform them that about the user behavior. So there will be another set of information that, in order to have the conversion for the AD network provider, let's say, need to be directed from the app to the AD network. So in the very moment you start using this technology, you need to have a back and forth of information between the app, the SDK, and the AD network, and you need to inform your user. Furthermore, you need to have a specific content. You need to have a specific content for that specific purpose. We're talking about marketing purposes. We're talking about processing of personal data collected for other reasons. So you need to have this content. Is that easy? Not at all. Also because, as we're seeing also on the online world with e-commerce and cookies, it's kind of difficult to get consent for each of the subjects that actually access your website. So how we can do it? Probably trying to have just one content with a privacy notice that links to all the privacy notices of the single company accessing the AD network. Is that easy? No. We will see where we go. The latest thing, the last thing that the authority said was about the retention period. In particular, in one case, they were talking about they were using a 13-month retention period, as it happens in France with the cookies, basically. And the authority said it's too much, because in 13 months of navigation through your mobile phone, you will see a lot of information, you will surf a lot of apps, and they will probably have outdated information after 13 months. So they suggested a 3-month period of retention. Overall, this is what happened until now in the world of this kind of technology. I say until now because basically like just, I think 3 days ago, in the latest keynote of Tim Cook and Apple, they revealed the iOS 14. And among the innovations that always come with each keynote of Apple, there's this new way of managing the identifier for advertisers. It was the base. It is the base of the use of the technology that we're talking about. This is a technology that is used in order, as I said before, of tracking, identifying a user, allowing advertisers to access data collected. Apple probably also trying to anticipate what will come with the privacy regulation, said that since our autumn, starting from autumn, when the iOS 14 will be launched, Apple will force all developers that want to use the identifier for advertiser for the purposes that we were saying before to ask a specific content together with Apple. So you cannot like you have now just the access to the ID, but you will need to ask specifically to each customer. So basically, by default, the app can be allowed to collect geolocation when they ask, but they will not use the ID for these purposes. This can be a really big game changer in the industry, in the mobile marketing industry, because of course, as this title of Forbes said, we risk to send an 80 billion industry into upheaval. So this is just a point of discussion. This is quite new, but I think that we're going there. So also big companies started thinking about how to give the power to consumers. So the advertisers will need to have probably a different approach, a more transparent approach, and they should try to understand which are all the subjects that within the same chain will collect those data in order to show the customer, because it will be more difficult starting from October for the iOS, and I expect also for Android users as soon as possible, probably. They will need to get this consent. In order to get this consent, you need to into people and make them understand in an easy way what you want to do with this data. That's it for me. Thank you. And
thank you for that. It's very, very interesting. I haven't had the chance to see the latest conference at Apple, but after your intervention, I will for sure do. So it is time for us to go to the next topic. So Marco will be addressing, as I said before, the topic about legal basis for our audience measuring technologies. So Marco.
Hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you, Giulio. And it has been a pleasure working with you the last months, the last year. Well, I share my okay. Can you see it? Okay. I turn off my camera so my connection will work better. Okay. Well, my presentation will open with a brief and legal analysis on the lawfulness of processing of personal data in general, and then we'll focus on the privacy issues of the lawfulness of processing of data collected through our technologies, AM technologies. Then, in the last part, brief notes on aggregation of such data will follow. As we know, according to the lawfulness principle, at Article 5, first paragraph, letter A of GDPR, personal data should be processed lawfully, meaning that they should be founded on a legal basis, which is represented by one of these provided for by Article 6, or with regard to the special categories of data, by one of those provided for by Article 9 of GDPR. Normally, the choice on the lawfulness basis of the processing of personal data depends on the purpose pursued, which is the scope, the aim of the processing decided by data controller. Purpose of processing opens a window on the substantial relationship between the data controller and the data subjects. In other words, the purpose of the data processing gives form and substance to the data processing and represents, in this sense, the compass in the hands of the data controller. Well, this is the rule. But however, there are exceptions. There can be exceptions in the legal system, one of which will be highlighted later as it may has regard to the processing of data collected through AM technologies. Well, looking at this presentation, we will assume that the purpose of processing of data collected through AM technology is represented by marketing, which is the one most frequently referred to in the cases of the supervisory authorities that we have analyzed in last months. What do we mean by marketing? We don't mean direct marketing intended as sending promotional communication, direct email marketing, but more generally, an evaluation for commercial purposes without any personalized impact. IDEST, a diagnostic and general analysis of customer demand aimed at establishing the most appropriate commercial actions to satisfy it in order to obtain a mutual benefit both for customers and business. Well, with respect to this processing purpose, we reasonably distinguish two main legal bases, the consent and the legitimate interest. When, on the first side, consent can be described as any freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous indication of the data subject's wishes, by which he or she by a statement or by a clear affirmative action signifies agreement to the processing of personal data relating to him or her. Well, on the other side, legitimate interest can be defined as the legitimate interest perceived by the controller or by a third party, which cannot be overridden by the interest or fundamental rights and freedom of the data subject, which require protection of personal data. Well, legitimate interest, as my colleagues said before, requires a legitimate interest assessment, the so-called LIA. LIA is a careful assessment of conflicting interests. On the one hand, the legitimate interest of the data controller or the third parties to carry out its processing activity, and on the other hand, the interests, rights, and the fundamental freedoms of the data subject involved. The legitimate interest may be an appropriate legal basis if, as a result of this assessment, data controller can prove that the position of the data subject is not compromised and prevaricated by the legitimate interest perceived. Well, the legitimate interest assessment should be carried out in the light of the principle of minimization, purpose limitation, and of course in the light of the mother of all the data processing principles, the principle of accountability. And among the main elements that data controller should be taken into account are those you can see in the slide. Of course, the reasonable expectation of the data subjects involved, the horizon of the reasonable expectation of data subjects, the purposes of processing, and in particular, the potential negative impacts on the data subjects, because data controller should take related technical and organizational measures designed to contain that risk. Well, in general, we can say that legitimate interest assessment should be carried out in concrete terms, but abstractly, normally, we can say that with reference to personal data collected through AM technologies, the processing of this data for marketing purposes may be based on the legitimate interest according to Article 6, first paragraph, letter F of GDPR. However, the more the outcomes of the LIA reveal critical issues for the interests, rights, and fundamental freedoms of data subjects, the more it may become necessary to require data subject to give specific consent according to Article 6, first paragraph, letter A of GDPR. In this perspective, in this sense, the consent acquires a dimension of guarantee of the position of the data subjects, and it makes possible the full self-determination of the data subject with respect to the processing of personal data concerning him or concerning her. Well, I have said that normally the choice on the legal basis of lawfulness depends on the purpose of the processing pursued. But even if marketing purpose is pursued, that there may be exceptions. Well, one of these exceptions is represented by the one provided for by Article 9, first paragraph of e-privacy directive, which refers to location data. Location data are defined as the same directive as any data processed in an electronic communication network indicating the geographical position of the terminal equipment of a user of a publicly available electronic communication service. Well, with regard to these data, they may only be processed when they are made anonymous or with the consent of the users of the subscribers to the extent and for the duration necessary for the provision of a value-added service. This is an important exception that therefore requires the data controller to anonymize the data in a preliminary stage or to request the data subject's consent. Well, now I'll go to the second part of my presentation, which focuses on aggregation, personal data aggregation. Aggregation is the process by which a certain number of homogeneous information, at least 3 units, are collected, considered as a whole, examined with statistical criteria, and then converted into additional numerical information of a percentage or absolute nature capable of expressing a statistical value. With regard to the AM technologies, 2 aggregation scenarios can be assumed in the abstract. In a first scenario, information collected through audience measurement technologies is aggregated with other information collected through the same technologies. In a second scenario, collected through audience measurement technologies is aggregated with information from different, for example, a data set bought from other companies. Well, it is important to note that aggregation is not necessarily anonymization, and aggregated data are not necessarily anonymized data, because they can maintain personal nature. Indeed, anonymization is a method that excludes the identification of the data subjects, and anonymized data can be considered personal data because through anonymization, the information can no longer be linked to the natural person to whom it previously referred. So, in order to establish whether the aggregated data actually have the nature of personal data, it is necessary to understand whether the data controller is actually able to re-identify the natural person to whom the aggregated personal data previously referred. It is necessary, in other words, to verify whether the data controller, starting from the consideration of the aggregated data only, is still able, maintains the effective possibility of tracing back to the data subject by linking all components of its information asset and using all the means reasonably available to the data controller itself. In this sense, we can say that if the data controller is still able to re-identify the data subject, the aggregated data must still be considered personal data, and this will imply the application of the legislation on the protection of personal data. GDPR will apply. If data controller is no longer able to re-identify the data subject, linking all the different components of its information asset and using all the means reasonably available to the data controller itself, GDPR won't apply. Well, these are general information about aggregation. Further details, of course, the white paper will help. And that's all. Thank you for your attention. And Julia, I'll give the floor to you, back to you.
Thank you, Marco. That was very interesting. I really liked the last part about aggregation, because one of the main topics that we had found in our white paper is that, of course, with those technologies, you try to extract as much anonymized data as you can, but then what happens when you bring those data together with other data sources? So will we be able to re-identify those subjects? Are those data for real anonymized? And so that was a really interesting part. I invite you all to have a look at our chapter 2 of our white paper. You would find more there. So, and another very, very interesting topic that was, the red line connecting all the dots and connecting all the topics in our white paper was the DPIA. We analyzed a lot of technologies. We had we analyzed a lot of decisions and opinions from the data protection authorities, but what we found the most is that you will need to do and to enact the DPIA. So let's hear more about the DPIA and also about the coolest thing of this white paper, which is actually a web tool that we had the chance to to design. For those of you who are lazy to go through the entire white paper, you can scroll that and see that on a web tool with some cool examples, which I'm sure Luca will give you an insight to. So Luca, please, it's your turn.
Thanks, Giulio. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Luca Milanesi, Governance and Privacy Manager at Fabbrica Digitale, and also my speech about the DPAA will be supported by some slides. So, first of all, what is a DPAA? Impact assessment is therefore an instrument that allows the data controller to analyze the risks and the impact of the present and other cases of the rights and freedoms of the data subject involved. And is the DPAA mandatory? So, well, given that the technologies examined here process personal data in a variety of ways, as a consequence, they could represent a high-level risk to the rights and freedoms of natural persons. So, a data protection impact assessment is mandatory if the processes involve at least the following elements, and I'm going to mention some of them, such as systematic monitoring, large-scale data processing, innovative use of application of a new technological or organizational solutions. But why is DPAA necessary? The data protection impact assessment is necessary when describing a given type of processing with a view to evaluating necessity, proportionality, and related risks. So carrying out a DPA is a continual process, not a one-time exercise. In order to better explore the issues I have just mentioned, it's necessary to present a smart attachment, a web tool that will allow a faster content creation. So, one moment, it's loading.
In the meanwhile, let me remind you all that if you have questions, we will have a question and answer session after the last intervention by Luca. If you're shy and don't want to speak loud and tell us what are your questions, you can write them in the chat and we will read them aloud so that we can have a little bit of a discussion. Sorry, Luca, we'll give you the floor.
Okay. Thanks. So now we are going to explore through the web tool the process we wanted to represent in the white paper. The tool allows you to change the theme, change language, and also open to in a new tab the white paper. Through the tool, you can easily view all the main topics of the document. Obviously, the content are a summary of the document itself. The document has a more technical and legal nature, while the web tool addresses a wider group of stakeholders, from innovation manager to marketing managers, and even CEO of PMI, because it allows to summarize the content of the document and to focus on risk analysis. So for each technology, we have represented in a synthetic way the description of the technology and how it works, the categories of data that can be potentially processed relating to processing purpose, the measure analyzed in the document with active links, the potential possibility and modalities for exercise the right, and the risk analysis. If you want to navigate simply, you can use the down bar. here. So our aims was to provide in a simple way, not an official methodology, dogmas or algorithms, but a tool that would leave awareness to the user, sample guidelines that can be applied according to the context. This awareness allows the stakeholders to understand that their technological choices, the related processing or not processing of personal data result in risks that must be identified and mitigated through the implementation of proper countermeasures. Before entering in the analysis, it's necessary to make some assumptions, such as we had identified the same risks for each technological system, such as unhelpful access to data, unwanted data change, and data loss. And the second is that for each examined technology, the same risk and consequently the same threats are applied. Well, as you can see, then the model helps us to understand that it's necessary to map which risk and threats act on the technology we would like to implement. Once we've determined the threats that can affect risks, and we have to understand the impacts and the probabilities of those threats. For example, I select hardware breakage. So in the context of privacy and information security, it's important to consider three main principles. So the confidential impact, availability impact, and integrity impact. So integrity means that the not alterability of the data. Availability means that the actual availability of the information whenever necessary. And confidentiality mean that access to information only to those who are duly authorized. So now that we have the threats valued in terms of impact and probability, we can calculate the risk simply by multiplying the factor mentioned above. So security impact and probability of occurrences. The probability and the impact parameters scores associated with threats are detailed in the paper, of course. Once we have calculated the risk for each threat, we can move on the second step, the mapping and the application of technical and organizational countermeasures aimed at mitigating the risk of threats. The third step represents the risk value of the threat after the application of the countermeasures previously valued. So residual risk threat is a risk threat less the value of the countermeasures applied. And now that the countermeasures have been applied to the threat, it's possible to move on the last step, the display of the risk of the residual risk for each risk category initially identified, and therefore the residual risk of the technology you selected before. Thanks for your attention, and I give the floor to Giulio.
Thanks. I said it was cool, but I didn't know it was that cool. No, jokes apart. It was a very nice effort from everyone. And let me just remind you that this tool is just an example of how we would structure a risk analysis. So it's not something that it is approved from data protection authorities. It's not something that you could use internally to draft your own data protection impact assessment. So you could use that as an example. And also what Luca was saying is that we tried to define some threats and some countermeasures, and some weights have been assigned to those threats and countermeasures. But that is the entire point of the DPIA. If you want to find out more about the DPIA, you could have a look at our chapter number 3, and the white paper. And I guess it was it for all our speakers. I thank you all. Maybe if there are questions, now is the time to speak loud. And as I said, if those of you want to write in the chat here, you could do that. I guess we have 5 or 10 minutes for questions, and we'll to learn and to understand if you have some. Otherwise, I can say, Alice or Francesco, that we can wrap it up, and we can close today's session.
Yeah.
Okay, here we are. So thank you very much. This was very interesting. We really appreciate the tool too. It's very cool. And so thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see each other, I hope, in the next webinar that we'll have. We are trying to have every Friday a webinar in the series of Enjoy IoT. So thank you everyone. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.